The grand hall of the royal palace was filled with a sense of excitement and anticipation. The air was thick with whispers of what was to come. It was the day of the most awaited event in the kingdom, an event that would be talked about for years to come. The royal court had gathered, the nobles dressed in their finest attire, and the musicians played softly in the background. The chandeliers sparkled, reflecting the golden light that bathed the entire room. The nobles and dignitaries waited, their eyes glued to the large, ornate doors at the far end of the hall. The queen was about to enter. She was known throughout the kingdom, not only for her beauty, but also for her wisdom and grace. She had been ruling for many years, and her people loved her dearly. Today, she was expected to make a speech that would change the course of history. She was to announce a new treaty that would strengthen alliances with neighboring kingdoms, ensuring peace and prosperity for all. The atmosphere in the room was electric as the courtiers eagerly whispered among themselves, wondering what she would say. Then, as the clock struck the hour, the grand doors swung open. All eyes turned toward her. The queen entered the room, dressed in a flowing gown of deep emerald green. Her dark hair shimmered under the light, and her regal presence filled the space. A hush fell over the room. Everyone stood in awe as she gracefully made her way to the center of the hall. Her every step was measured, her movements fluid and graceful. As if she was gliding across the floor, the queen's eyes scanned the room, a slight smile on her lips. It was a smile that made everyone feel special, as if she was speaking directly to each of them. She stopped at the podium, raised her hand, and the room fell silent. She was about to speak, and everyone knew that her words would be powerful. But then, something happened. The queen's face suddenly contorted in pain. Her smile faded, and her eyes widened in alarm. It was as if the strength had been drained from her in an instant. She staggered, her hand gripping the edge of the podium for support. Her knees buckled, and before anyone could react, she collapsed to the ground. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. The nobles stood frozen, too shocked to move. Some looked to one another, not understanding what had just happened. The royal guards rushed to her side, but it was clear that something was terribly wrong. She lay there, motionless, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The room erupted into chaos. The royal physicians were called immediately. They rushed to the queen's side, their faces grim as they examined her. Her pulse was weak, and her body was cold. The physicians whispered among themselves, their expressions filled with confusion and fear. They couldn't find a cause for her sudden collapse. Was it a heart attack? A stroke? They couldn't say. The queen had been in perfect health just hours before, and now she was barely clinging to life. The nobles stood back, murmuring among themselves, their faces filled with concern. Some were genuinely worried, while others seemed more interested in the implications of the queen's condition. What would happen to the kingdom if she didn't recover? Who would take her place? The political game was beginning, and the whispers of power were already circulating. But through the panic, one figure remained calm. The human guard, stationed at the back of the room, stepped forward. His face was calm, though his heart was racing. He had served the queen for many years, and his loyalty was unquestionable. He had seen her in moments of great strength and moments of vulnerability, but he had never seen her like this. Her sudden collapse was unlike anything he had witnessed. He knew the queen was strong, both mentally and physically, and this was not a mere fainting spell. Something was wrong, something deeper than anyone could see. The guard knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. The physicians seemed to pay him no mind as they hurried to work, but the guard's eyes narrowed. He could feel the tension in the air, the uncertainty that hung like a thick fog. There was something about the situation that didn't sit right with him. He had always been observant, and he could tell that the queen's collapse was no accident. His instincts told him that this was more than just a sudden illness. Someone was behind this, someone who wanted the queen out of the picture. He didn't know who or why, but the feeling gnawed at him. The guards who had been stationed around the room began to clear the space, pushing the nobles back and maintaining order. But it was clear that the court was shaken. The queen's collapse had stunned them all. The murmurs grew louder as people speculated on the cause. Some whispered of enemies within the court, others of rivals from other kingdoms. The truth, however, remained hidden, buried beneath layers of confusion and fear. The human guard stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the room. He knew that his loyalty to the queen would soon be put to the test. He would uncover the truth behind this mysterious collapse, no matter the cost. His heart told him that something darker was at play, and it was up to him to find the answers before it was too late. As the physicians worked frantically to stabilize the queen, the guard made a silent vow. He would not rest until he had unraveled the mystery behind her collapse, and the truth would come to light. The queen lay motionless on the cold marble floor, her once vibrant presence now overshadowed by an unsettling stillness. The noble court had fallen silent, its grandeur diminished in the face of an unfolding crisis. The hum of whispered conversations grew louder as the royal physicians scrambled around her, their expressions pale with confusion. None of them had any answers, and the weight of their failure hung in the air like an oppressive storm cloud. In the midst of the chaos, the human guard stood apart from the rest of the court, his sharp eyes scanning the scene with cold precision. He had seen many things in his years of service, but this was different. The queen, the strong and wise ruler who commanded the loyalty of her people, had been brought down by something unseen. The physicians murmured among themselves, their hands shaking as they attempted to revive her. But their efforts seemed futile. There was no obvious reason for the queen's sudden collapse. Her body showed no visible signs of illness, no marks of injury, nothing that could explain her sudden loss of consciousness. The guard felt an instinctive unease settle deep within him. He had spent years at the queen's side, learning her mannerisms, her habits, even the smallest details of her life. He knew her better than anyone in this court, and yet, what had just happened was beyond his understanding. As the physicians worked, the noblemen and women began to murmur anxiously amongst themselves. Their faces were masks of concern, but the guard could see through the veneer of politeness. Some of them were already plotting, calculating the power vacuum this event could create. The collapse of the queen was not only a health crisis, it was an opportunity, a crack in the foundation of the kingdom that could be exploited. The court's political landscape was about to change, and everyone here knew it. A part of the guard wanted to turn away, to let the physicians do their work, but something told him that the queen's collapse was no ordinary accident. He stepped closer to the queen, his boots making barely a sound as he moved. The others in the room barely noticed him, too absorbed in their own worries or ambitions. He reached the queen's side and knelt down beside her, his eyes flickering between her pale face and the physicians, who continued to fumble through their efforts. One of the physicians, a woman with sharp features and an air of authority, looked up from her work. Her eyes met the guard's, and for a moment, he saw something he hadn't expected: fear. She quickly averted her gaze, as if trying to mask the emotion. The guard's instincts flared. He had seen that look before, the look of someone who had uncovered something they weren't supposed to know. But there was no time to address it now. The queen needed him. He gently placed his hand on her wrist, checking for a pulse. It was faint but steady. At least that was something. But the faintness only added to his suspicions. The queen had been in perfect health only a few hours ago. She had stood before the court, poised and confident, ready to announce a major treaty that would secure her kingdom's future. And now, she was here collapsed, as if a switch had been flipped in an instant. A murmur of voices echoed through the hall, and the guard's gaze shifted. Several high-ranking nobles, including the royal advisor, had gathered at the back of the room. Their faces were a mixture of concern and calculation. The guard could see the wheels turning behind their eyes. Power was shifting, and they were already positioning themselves for whatever might come next. He knew some of them better than he cared to. They had always been too eager, too hungry for influence. If they saw an opportunity to gain control, they would take it without hesitation. But none of that mattered now. The queen was his responsibility. He had taken an oath to protect her, and this strange, sudden collapse was a threat to everything she stood for. He couldn't afford to get caught up in courtly politics. His only focus had to be finding the truth. As the minutes passed, the physicians grew more frantic. One of them began to pour a strange, green liquid into a vial, muttering words the guard couldn't quite catch. Another one checked the queen's eyes, his hands trembling. It was clear that no one in this room was prepared for what had just happened. No one knew what to do. The guard stood up, taking a step back. He had seen enough. It was time for him to act. The suspicion that had been gnawing at him for the past few minutes grew stronger, urging him forward. Something was wrong, and he couldn't wait for the court to figure it out. The Queen's collapse was not a random accident. It was a carefully planned event, and whoever was behind it had made their move. He glanced around the room once more, noticing the subtle tension in the air. The nobles, the advisors, the courtiers, they were all watching, waiting for the next move. Some were already discussing who might take over the throne, while others were speaking in hushed tones about the potential fallout from this incident. The guard's eyes narrowed as he realized something important. The political vultures were already circling, eager to take advantage of the Queen's weakness. But the guard wasn't fooled. He knew the Queen better than anyone. This wasn't a mere health scare. This was an attack. With determination in his eyes, he turned on his heel and walked toward the door. The court may have been in chaos, but he had a mission: to uncover the truth behind the Queen's collapse, before anyone else could take advantage of the situation. Whoever had orchestrated this knew what they were doing, but so did he, and he would not rest until the mystery was solved. The guard moved swiftly through the halls of the palace, his boots echoing softly against the stone floors. His mind raced as he passed the grand tapestries and portraits of past rulers, their painted eyes seeming to follow his every move. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. The Queen was gravely ill, and no one seemed to understand the true depth of the danger. But the guard knew deep down that this was no ordinary illness. It was something far more sinister, something that had been carefully planned. As he passed through the palace's winding corridors, he couldn't help but think about the Queen. She had always been so strong, so poised, her every decision made with the kingdom's best interests at heart. She had been a beacon of stability in a world full of uncertainty. To see her crumpled on the floor, helpless, was an image that haunted him. Whoever had done this had attacked the very heart of the kingdom, and now the guard had to find out who. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, a whisper, barely audible, but enough to catch his attention. He froze, his senses on high alert. The guard's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sword as he scanned the corridor. It was then that he saw her, a young maid, hurrying down the hallway, her face pale and drawn with fear. She glanced over her shoulder as if checking to make sure no one was following her. And when she saw the guard, her eyes widened in surprise. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, you must help." The guard stepped closer, his expression softening. "What's happened? Speak quickly." The maid's gaze darted nervously, her hands twisting in the folds of her dress. I saw something strange." She paused, as though unsure of how to explain what she had witnessed. Before the Queen collapsed, she was meeting with someone, a man, but he wasn't from the court. He wore a hood and kept his face hidden. I couldn't hear everything they said, but it looked like she was frightened. She was arguing with him, and when he left, she seemed different, like something had changed. The guard's heart skipped a beat. This was the first real lead he had. A stranger in the palace. A hidden meeting. It all pointed to one thing: the Queen's collapse had been orchestrated, and someone on the inside was involved. The guard's mind raced as he considered his next move. The palace was full of secrets, but the royal chambers were the most private of all. If the Queen had been meeting with someone in secret, the answers might lie there. "Where did this man go?" he asked urgently. The maid hesitated, her eyes darting back down the hallway. "I don't know, but I saw him leave through the side door. He headed toward the royal gardens." Without wasting another moment, the guard motioned for her to stay quiet and moved toward the direction she had pointed. The royal gardens were expansive, a place of tranquility and beauty. But tonight they felt like a labyrinth of danger. The guard's pulse quickened as he approached the side entrance, making sure to stay hidden in the shadows. Every instinct told him that the answers he sought were just beyond this door. The garden was eerily quiet, the sound of distant water trickling from the fountains the only noise that broke the silence. The guard moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the area. There, in the distance, he spotted a figure standing near the edge of the garden, his back to the guard. The man was tall, draped in a long cloak, his face still hidden beneath the hood. This was it. The man from the Queen's secret meeting, The guard's heart raced as he took a deep breath. Steadying himself, he needed to act fast. The man was the key to everything, and the guard couldn't afford to let him slip away. Every step he took was calculated, each movement as silent as possible. As he approached the figure, he reached for his sword, ready to confront him. But just as he was about to call out, the man turned around. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments, and in that instant, the guard knew something was wrong. The man's eyes were cold, calculating, and yet there was something familiar about them. Before the guard could react, the man stepped back, disappearing into the shadows of the garden. The guard's instincts kicked in. He ran after him, his feet pounding the ground as he chased the mysterious figure through the winding paths of the royal garden. The man was fast, his movements fluid and purposeful, as if he had done this many times before. But the guard was relentless. He wouldn't let the person who was behind the queen's collapse escape. Suddenly, the figure stopped, turning to face the guard. "You shouldn't have followed me," the man said, his voice low and steady. "Now, you'll regret it." The guard's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword, his eyes narrowing with resolve. "I will stop you," he replied, his voice unwavering. "I will find out the truth." In the stillness of the royal garden, the two stood face to face, the air thick with tension. The mystery was beginning to unravel, but this was just the beginning. The guard knew that the truth would be even darker than he imagined, and he was ready to uncover every secret, no matter the cost. The chase had led the guard deeper into the labyrinth of the royal gardens. But despite his relentless pursuit, the mysterious man had vanished like a ghost into the shadows. The garden, once a serene haven of flowers and fountains, now felt like a battlefield. Each whisper of the wind seemed to carry a warning, and every rustling leaf was a potential clue. The guard stopped for a moment, his chest heaving from the exertion, his eyes scanning the darkened paths for any sign of movement. He cursed under his breath. The man was slippery, but that only made him more determined. Whoever was behind the queen's sudden collapse was a mastermind, and the guard knew that time was running out. If the man wasn't stopped soon, there would be more lives at stake than just the queen's. Turning back toward the palace, the guard realized that the only way forward was through the heart of the court itself. He needed to gain access to the most restricted areas, the ones where secrets were buried deep. The royal chambers, the council's inner sanctum. These places held the answers he sought, but they were also the most dangerous. If he wasn't careful, his every move would be under surveillance. In a palace filled with enemies, one wrong step could be fatal. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of footsteps. He quickly flattened himself against a nearby stone pillar, holding his breath as two figures emerged from the shadows. It was the royal advisor and the captain of the guard, both looking agitated. The advisor was speaking in low tones, his words barely audible. "If the queen doesn't recover soon, we'll need to make a move. The throne can't remain vacant for long." His voice was steady, but the weight of his words was clear. The captain nodded, a grim look on his face. The guard's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized just how quickly the court was shifting. If they were already planning for the queen's death, it meant that something far more sinister was at play. The advisor had always been a man of ambition, but the guard had always trusted him, and now doubt crept into his mind. Could there be a conspiracy within the very walls he had sworn to protect? As the two men walked past, the guard's instincts flared. He couldn't follow them, at least not without alerting them to his presence. Instead, he had to think of another way to get the information he needed. He waited until they were out of sight, then made his way back toward the palace's inner corridors. There was one place left to search: the queen's personal chambers. He approached the door cautiously, checking to see if anyone was nearby. The palace was quiet, too quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath. With a quick glance around, the guard slipped inside. The room was dimly lit by candles, casting flickering shadows across the royal furnishings. The queen's bed was still untouched, the sheets folded neatly. But something felt off. The guard's eyes narrowed as he scanned the room, looking for anything that might give him a clue. Then he spotted it: an old, dusty chest at the foot of the bed. He had never seen it before. Moving swiftly, the guard opened it, revealing a collection of documents, most of them sealed with the royal crest. But one parchment caught his eye. It was crumpled, as if someone had hurriedly tried to hide it. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the contents. It was a letter from the Queen herself, written just days before her collapse. The words were clear, but the tone was urgent, even frantic. I am being watched. I have made a decision that will change everything, but I fear it may be too late. There are those who seek to control the throne, and I can feel their eyes upon me. The guard's blood ran cold. The Queen had known something was wrong, but had she known just how far the conspiracy reached, and who was behind it all? Before he could read further, he heard a noise at the door. His heart raced as he quickly shoved the letter back into the chest and closed it. Just as a figure entered the room, it was the Queen's most trusted maid, her face pale with worry. She didn't seem to notice the guard at first, but when she did, her eyes widened in recognition. "What are you doing here?" she whispered harshly, fear in her voice. The guard didn't hesitate. "I need your help," he said quietly. "You know the Queen better than anyone. What was she afraid of? Who was she writing to?" The maid hesitated, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. Then, in a low, urgent voice, she said, "The Queen." She was afraid of her closest advisors. "And there's someone from the outside, someone powerful who was pulling the strings. I don't know who, but the Queen knew she had to act before it was too late." The guard's mind raced. The pieces were finally falling into place, but the final puzzle piece was still missing. There was a betrayal within the court, a shadowy figure pulling the strings, and the Queen had known it all along. She had been fighting alone, but now it was up to him to finish what she had started. He would stop the conspiracy, no matter the cost. The quiet of the palace halls felt oppressive, like the calm before a storm. The guard's mind was racing with the revelations from the Queen's hidden letter, the cryptic warnings about her advisors, and the shadowy figure from outside. Each piece of the puzzle had brought him closer to the truth, but still, there was a growing sense of unease. The conspiracy was far-reaching, and the Queen had known it was too dangerous to act alone. She had left clues, but now it was his turn to follow them to the very heart of the treachery. The maid's words echoed in his mind. The Queen had trusted someone on the inside, and it was clear that the enemy was someone who had been playing a long game. As the guard moved deeper into the palace, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He had always trusted his instincts, and right now, they were screaming that someone was close, someone who didn't want him to find the truth. He stopped at the foot of a spiral staircase, its stone steps winding upward into the royal tower. The room at the top was the royal advisor's private office, a place where only the most trusted figures in the court were allowed. It was here that many of the kingdom's most sensitive matters were discussed, and it was also the most likely place for the conspiracy to have taken root. The guard knew he had to go up there, but his every move was becoming more dangerous by the second. If the advisor was involved, and the guard had no doubt that he was, the confrontation would be inevitable. With one final glance over his shoulder, the guard ascended the stairs. The air grew colder with every step, and the silence seemed to press against his ears. He reached the top, and as he slowly pushed open the door, he found the room eerily quiet. The royal advisor's office was a lavish space, filled with rich tapestries and gleaming artifacts from distant lands. It looked like a place of power, of calculated decisions and hidden motives. But in that moment, the guard saw it for what it really was, a lair. His eyes scanned the room quickly, looking for anything out of place. A desk sat at the far end, papers scattered across its surface, but nothing seemed to be in immediate danger. The guard's gaze flicked toward the large wooden cabinet in the corner of the room. It was old, its wood worn with age, but it was the only thing in the room that stood out. He moved toward it slowly, each step measured, his heart pounding in his chest. As he opened the cabinet door, a sudden noise behind him made him freeze. The guard spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his sword. But the figure that stood in the doorway wasn't an enemy, it was the royal advisor himself. His face as cold and calculating as ever. "You've been very thorough," the advisor said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "But you're too late." The guard's grip tightened on the hilt of his sword. "What have you done? Why are you behind this?" The Queen, the advisor interrupted, his eyes narrowing, was a puppet. She never understood the true power of this kingdom. I did what was necessary, what was best for everyone. She was too soft. But now, with her incapacitated, the throne is mine. The guard's blood boiled. The advisor was behind it all. The collapse of the queen, the carefully orchestrated scheme, it was all part of his plan. The guard stepped forward, his voice low and fierce. "You won't get away with this." The advisor smirked, his hand resting on the hilt of his own sword. "What will you do, guard? You think you can stop me? You're just a pawn in a much larger game." But the guard wasn't afraid. The truth had finally been revealed. The queen had known the threat was within her own court, and now it was his turn to end it. With a swift motion, the guard lunged at the advisor, his sword flashing in the dim light of the room. The advisor parried, but the guard's speed was unmatched. Every movement was driven by the need to protect the queen, to stop this betrayal from consuming the kingdom. The fight was fierce, a blur of steel and fury. The advisor was strong, but the guard was determined. He wasn't fighting for power, for ambition, or for revenge. He was fighting for the queen, for everything she had built. The kingdom deserved better than this. With one final, decisive strike, the guard disarmed the advisor, sending his sword clattering to the floor. The advisor staggered back, his face pale with fury and fear. "You've won this battle," he sneered, "but the war is far from over." The guard stood tall, his breath heavy, but his resolve unshaken. "The queen will rise again," he said, his voice steady, "and you will be held accountable for everything you've done." As the advisor was taken away, the guard couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the palace still held. The conspiracy had been stopped, but it was clear that the kingdom was far from safe. The road ahead would be difficult, but as long as the queen's legacy endured, there was hope. The guard had uncovered the truth, and he would not rest until the kingdom was whole again. The palace was alive with a strange, tense energy as the guard made his way back to the queen's chambers. The royal advisor had been taken into custody, but the guard knew this victory was only a small part of the larger battle. The queen still lay unconscious, her fate uncertain, and the entire court was in a state of confusion. With the truth of the conspiracy now exposed, he couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of unease. Who else in the court might be involved? How deep did the betrayal run? As he entered the queen's chambers, he was met by a new set of physicians, their faces filled with quiet determination. They worked in silence, checking the queen's vital signs and administering new treatments. The guard stood back, observing, hoping that the queen's strength would return. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the clock was ticking. Then, in a moment that felt like an eternity, the queen's eyes fluttered open. She looked at him with confusion, then recognition. "You," she whispered, her voice weak but steady. "You found it, didn't you? You found the truth." The guard nodded, his heart lifting with relief. "The advisor is imprisoned. The plot is over." The queen's lips curled into a faint, tired smile. "It's not over. It's just beginning." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. As the guard stood beside her, he realized that the real work had only just started. The kingdom might be safe for now, but there was still so much to rebuild. And the queen, despite everything, would lead them forward. Together, they would confront whatever came next. The days that followed the queen's recovery were filled with uncertainty and cautious optimism. The palace, once a place of whispers and hidden agendas, now felt like a battleground. But the queen had proven her resilience, and with the guard's help, the traitors within her court had been exposed. Yet, as the dust settled, the weight of the next challenge loomed larger than ever. The queen stood before her court, her presence commanding attention despite her weakened state. The nobles, who had once been so eager to plot behind her back, now watched her with a mix of fear and awe. The betrayal had rattled them, but it had also reminded them of her power, the power she had always held. Even when they underestimated her, the guard, standing at her side, noticed a shift in the air. The court was not the same. There was a new respect for her, a recognition of her strength. But beneath that, there was also an undercurrent of fear. Fear that they had misjudged her for too long, and now the queen would show no mercy. As she addressed the court, her voice steady and resolute, the guard felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. The queen was not just a figurehead. She was a force to be reckoned with. a leader who had faced the darkest of betrayals and emerged stronger. "I will not let the kingdom fall to those who seek to tear it apart," she declared, her eyes scanning the room. "But I will need those who truly stand with me." The guard knew that this was only the beginning. There would be more threats, more shadows lurking in the corners of the palace. But with the queen's unwavering resolve and his loyalty by her side, they were ready to face whatever came next.